All right, I think it's time to get started. Um, Welcome back to another installment. Happy to see you here. And we're going to continue on course to build our awesome app. So up to this point, we'll go through what we've done so far. And today we're going to be working with a database. So that's exciting times. This is actually kind of a fun time when you're building an app, because this is when you're taking something that's just like a generic toy and turning it into something real when you start storing the data. And that's actually really cool and really fun. And presents its own challenges, obviously, because you have to figure out how you're going to model that data. Maybe we'll go into a little bit of that if we have time, but yeah, I'm going to try to keep this under an hour, so we'll see how it goes. All right, so should I maybe launch into the notes here? Let me switch devices. Here we are. Yeah, so welcome back again. This is frameworkless.js, just a little boilerplate. This is a vanilla JavaScript Node.js tutorial course done through live streams. We're on part 4. We've already built quite a bit of stuff. Let's take a look. We've built a Node.js app with existing HTTP functionality that comes with Node. We created a static file directory where we serve static assets from, like images or text files and so forth, or HTML pages. We created dynamic routing, so our app should work just fine with dynamic routes. We implemented handlebars as our templating engine, and we're now serving templates using the dynamic routes. And the last time around, we built a data parser for our form. So we can collect user data and use it. It was a really simple one before, and I'll go into that in a minute about the next part of that. Yeah, so just a reminder of what we're actually doing. This course is actually going to be building a real product, and we're going to launch this when these streams are done. And that is going to be Remindist. Remindist is, we can just click the link here. Remindist is a really simple thing. It just, you schedule an email for yourself and it sends it into the future. So we touch on a whole bunch of different topics as a result of these 6 or 7 streams. And today we're going to be working with the actual database. So we're going to be saving stuff to the database. So that's an exciting part. And last time I promised you guys that I would be releasing certain parts of the boilerplate code as NPM modules. So that's what this is. So I've just released the first one. So what we did last session was build this body parser. And I've released it as a module so that you can use it in your own modules without having to reinvent the wheel. It was also very basic before. It only handled certain data types, for example, just form data. And this time around, I implemented a fairly complex system that now handles file uploads, multi-part data, and all this wonderful stuff. So check that package out. We're going to be using it going forward because, yeah, we already have a really basic one, and if you want a more in-depth explanation of how does a body parser supposed to work, you can check out the code for it. It's all on GitHub. It's part of the same organization that the actual Remindist project is on. So that's here. And the code is actually all in one file, so you can find it all here. It uses one module called busboy to handle some of the multi-part data, but for the rest of it, you'll find that it's pretty straightforward. If you have a read, it's only 61 lines long. You can have a read and see. Also, if you see anything wrong with it or anything you'd like me to add or edit, please don't hesitate to submit a pull request or open an issue, and I will definitely get back to you, because this is, I think, an important aspect of a frameworkless application. And then, are we actually creating our own framework? Well, I guess a little bit, but at the same time, we're also just creating little modules you can use anywhere. So it doesn't necessarily account to a framework. They're just little modules that you can use. If you call that a framework, that's fine. Maybe we should rename it from frameworkless to something else then. But yeah, that's kind of it. Using it is just as we did the old one, except you import parse body. So you import that, and in your request handler function, and we're going to do this in a second just to show you, you use that function instead of the one from your own lib folder. So let's do, or let's implement that without further ado. We're currently using only one spot where we're parsing form data, and that is in routes, new reminder. So a reminder of what this code does. This is where we save the actual data, or collect the data from a form. So if you remember what we have up to this point, it's this. So you can type in your email, then a message, hit submit, and it gets populated in the next page. So we're already collecting the data, and we have a really simple form parser that does this stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to use the new form parser. So in order to get that done, we're going to need to install the new module. So let's go ahead and do that. You can just run npm install save, and it's namespace at frameworkless.js/body parser. So you know what, that's the one. This might take a minute. La 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 la. Right. Installing. Okay, here we go. So we're going to implement it in the new reminder route. Really simple to do. So one of the first things that we do in the file here is import our form data, lib form data file, and instead we're going to import the module, like so. And the next thing is we're going to change this into this, because that's the name of the new function that we're using to parse form data. Everything else is pretty much the same. So we can just do npm run start now for our app, and it should be running again. We also don't need our old form data parser. You can see it here. This is actually just a really basic version of the same one that the package is. So you can actually take a look at the package and this one and the difference, and figure it out for yourself how easy it actually is to put it together. All right. So moving along, this should theoretically work the same. So if we go back to Remindist, our app here, nothing should change in terms of functionality. So I'm going to try that out now. Yeah, indeed. So it parses the same stuff. So we got the email and we got the message all parsed. So that handles the form parsing that we touched on last time. And now let's talk about databases. My personal favorite for relational databases is Postgres. Postgres has been around for decades, for a very long time. That's a very long time in tech, especially. And the reason it's existed for so long is because it implements, first of all, SQL, semantic query language, which has stood the test of time. People have innovated on for a long time, but still keeps enough of the specifications the same. So like, for example, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle Server, Microsoft SQL Server, they all implement the same language, but just in different, small differences here and there. So it's very easy for someone to kind of go from one to the other and still be able to know what's going on, right? So that's the great thing about Postgres, SQL in general. And Postgres is really awesomely maintained by the open source community. There's a lot of really helpful and useful modules for it. They're called extensions. Also, I find that some of the built-in features are really awesome. Like, for example, with some of the binary JSON you can store, you don't actually need a non-relational database anymore, potentially. And the other thing is that there's modules out there, extensions for it that serve geospatial data. So it's really great that one of the big advantages of MongoDB is the geospatial coordinates, so like latitude and longitude, or moving around on a grid, or things like that. So MongoDB does that really well, and there's a great module for that in Postgres. And the reason I would even mention that is because, I'm building an application that's to do with maps, and geospatial coordinates are really useful to have as part of your database, because it really renders your code a lot shorter because you don't have to do it manually. So yeah, props to Postgres. And as I was doing a little bit of research for Postgres for the stream, I came across these awesome logos. So the current logo, of course, is the Slonik, which is I'm not quite sure where it came from, and a lot of people don't really know, but Slon is Russian for elephant. And Slonik is like a little elephant. Like Dutch people would appreciate this because they put "je" on the end of words when they try to make it small. So like biertje instead of beer. So Slonik is like a way of saying slon, but it's a little elephant. Anyways, so that's the current mascot. But take a look at these awesome logos. So one of the first ones was this one here, the Postgres SQL written in like super fancy, I don't even know what, early 90s hacker font. I just love it. Yeah, I think these are awesome. Really great examples of graphic design from the former web, of what it used to look like in the old days. You kind of look at some of the new rebrands and products out there, and you compare it to some of the old stuff, and it's quite hilarious actually. So yeah. Now a few things that I'm going to do as part of this stream as well is I'm removing the package lock file and adding it to gitignore. This isn't necessarily something you want to always do, especially if you're working in a distributed team. It's a great thing to do in order for you to all have the same packages all the time. But for me, because we're switching from branch to branch and we're currently installing modules in every single branch, for example, it makes it quite difficult to manage package lock because there's always a merge conflict. So I'm really sick of it, and I'm just going to kill package lock from the repository. npm works fine without it. It just creates a log file when you do npm install the first time, and it deploys fine onto servers without package lock. But yeah, I'm kind of sick of working with package lock for the moment because of my unique edge case, but you guys maybe think twice about that. And the other thing is that we're going to be working with .sql files, so we're going to be writing our SQL in .sql files. So we also need to edit the command to start our nodemon because we want the app to restart when we change gears here. So under the start command on line 17, I'm just going to add SQL to the end of the command. And just as a refresher, nodemon is the thing that restarts your app every time it watches for changes, and every time you change your code, it restarts. --inspect is what connects you to the debugger if you have one open. And -e tells nodemon which extensions it should be watching. So right now it watches JS, HTML, HBS, handlebars, and SQL files. And that is sufficient for us at the moment. So I'm just going to restart the app now. Now we input a new command. By the way, you might have noticed that it seems like every stream I have different surroundings. Right now I'm cramped into this little room. It's a tiny little Skype room at a co-working space in Hong Kong. Yeah, it's actually quite easy to find spaces with good internet where you can stream from, but it's also difficult in some ways. So yeah, interesting learning for me, finding a spot where you can stream from every other Tuesday. All right, so now that we're working with databases, I would like to once again do my spiel about frameworks and libraries. We're going to be using the PG module, Node Postgres, written by Brian Carlson. Brian Carlson has a crap load of modules, open source modules that he's written. He's a fantastic open source author, so please, if you get a chance, sponsor him. But yeah, the PG module is a fantastic resource. It's been around for quite a while. It's very well written, quite fast, with a lot of different extensions that you can add to it. And we're going to be using it because it's also pretty bare metal. It doesn't add any ORM features, that's object relational mapper. It only does the basics, which is give you a query interface and connects to the database. And I think that's kind of all we need at the moment. And the other nice feature that it has is that it comes with connection pools built in. If you're not familiar with a connection pool, oftentimes whenever your app opens, if you don't have a connection pool, it may open a single client to open up that database connection. But a connection pool makes sure that they're recycled. So when the app is done with one particular connection, it closes it or gives it to another thread of the same application, passes it on, so that you can actually keep your application running much more efficiently, and there's not a danger of it crashing because it caps the amount of connections that it can do to your database. So connection pooling is pretty important. We're going to be using that from the very start. Now, to install Postgres module, we just need to go to our terminal. Mine is in my editor here, but you can use it wherever you want. And install PG, the PG module. So once that finishes, we will be ready to move on. All right, so npm run start once again. So the couple things that we need to do in order to make this work properly. The first thing is we need to create a Postgres database somewhere. You could be running it on localhost, so you can use Homebrew or something similar to install Postgres locally on your machine, and then spin off a database there. What my personal preference is, I like to use Heroku databases, the free ones, the free tier ones. So I create an app and then connect to it, and then I create a Postgres database as one of the add-ons. And because it's free, I don't really care, and I just needed to develop a database, and it saves me having to run Postgres locally and keep it up to date and so forth. So yeah, that's kind of the thing. So your database URL, you'll need to add the new environment variable. So as you remember, we have a env file here. So to it, you want to add the database URL. So I have one of my own. It's in my env file. I'm not going to open it because you can rewind this and see my database URL. But you want to add it like so: database URL equals Postgres, and it'll start with Postgres, something along those lines, and that way. The only thing you'll want to do, you'll want to make sure that it ends with SSL equals true if you're using a Heroku database. You want that at the end of the URL. Otherwise, it might give you connection errors when you try to connect to it. Anyway, so do that in your .env file. And moving right along, we're going to create a new initializer. Now, what is an initializer? We covered this earlier on when we built the HTTP one. An initializer is just something that gets started when your app is booted up and is then made available throughout your process. So it's something that needs to be started, but only once when your app is running. So let's go ahead and create an initializer and call it Postgres. So that'll be in the initializers folder. And you can just copy this code here. Usually it hovers a little thing that says copy, but ugly white space. Those of you who've been watching for a while know that I'm a bit of a white space Nazi. So I'm going to have to fix that first before I can continue. I can't do it. All right. So this is the initializer. So if we take a look at the code, it grabs the pool object or class from the PG module. And what I talked about earlier, the connection pools, that's what this is. It also looks for the database URL environment variable on the process. If a database URL is not set, aka it's not in your env file, it'll throw an error, so the application will crash. And then it exports this, which is just essentially a new pool with a connection string set to your database URL. So very simple. This is probably the easiest code you'll ever have to write. This is it. So the next step is, of course, to use it somewhere. So we're going to use it in app.js. So we're going to modify app.js a little bit. All right. So one of the first things we need to do is I'm going to put I'm going to modify this slightly to make it a little more complex. So we're going to, first of all, start by including our DB initializer, Postgres. The second thing is I'm going to wrap the startup function into a function itself. The reason I do this is because then we can export this also later. I'll get to that at a later point, but it's also nice to have it all contained in one place. And for example, if one of these initializers was asynchronous, we could also account for that using the run function. So that's kind of my preferred way of doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a function called run, and inside of it we're going to do server. So that's our HTTP server. And inside of it, we're going to pass DB, which is our database connection pool. And next, we're just going to make sure that we run this function at the end here, right? So, moving along. So now we have a database initializer, and the initializer is launched and initialized when the app starts, and a DB instance is passed as a part of an object into the server. So the next step is to pass the DB object to where it needs to go. In the DB initializer, HTTP initializer, this is the function we're running when we run server, right? So we need to pass the DB in there because, well, we're passing the DB in there anyways, but we need to be able to receive it here. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to add that here. And the next step is we want to also add it to the response params. So you'll find this around line 24 or so in your code, assuming you're close to what the repository is. So you'll want to add this. So a quick rundown of what we're doing here. This response params is just a big object of stuff that might be useful to our individual routes, or possibly our static files. So earlier on, we're testing to see if there's a file extension present on the request URL. So someone's requesting something with a file extension, and if so, the only thing we need to really provide is the extension, and then we serve the serve static file function. It does the serving. Otherwise, the serve route does, right? So in the case of a serve route, we are also adding the request object to the response params, and we're adding this context object. That's going to grow as time goes on, but at the moment it just has an app name in it from our environment variables. And then the response params DB will give the users, the routes, access to the database itself. So it can run database queries. So as a reminder, this is the pool, essentially, that we initialized, and it's just being passed down along the line to here. And everything else in your HTTP initializer should pretty much stay the same. And then the next step, what we want to do next, is do something similar in responder.js. That's in the lib folder. And on line 4, no, I'm wrong, line 35. Yep, line 35. Yeah, line 35. We want to add the DB argument here into the deconstruction of the first object, because as you remember in HTTP, the first parameter is this response params, right? So we are deconstructing it to take request, context, and DB out separately of it, right? And the second thing is the response, so that's about the same. So you see response here, and there's the initial object. That's the request params right there. So the next thing is we also want to give it to the data hook that we wrote before. Now, as you remember, the hook is something that happens before we render the page. In this case here we have exports.data, and it gets the body of the form that that somebody filled in, and then it returns it for use later on in the handlebars. Oh, got a message. I'm gonna close this so it doesn't distract me. Yeah, so that's what we're doing, and that happens on line 7, so route.data, and then instead of just passing the request, we're going to pass an object that can be deconstructed. That's in responder. So we, instead of request here on line 45, we're going to pass request and DB in one object. And the reason we do objects instead of just arguments is actually because arguments are kind of difficult to keep track of. Like if you ever write a function where you have to remind yourself what the arguments are, that is kind of an annoying time you're going to have, because then you have to remember, oh shit, database comes first, then request, you don't know. And then there's also the case of sometimes those things are undefined, so you're just passing an undefined first parameter, and then the second parameter is defined, and so forth. I find it's much easier to be able to pass an object, and then it can be deconstructed a lot easier. And also, of course, it's just a lot easier to look at and a lot easier to read. And then the last thing we need to do is, of course, because this data function is being run, it's no longer just taking a request parameter, so we need to add a DB parameter in here as well. We're not using the DB at the moment, we still have a bit of work to do, but the point is that our data hook is able to receive the DB. So let's just make sure everything's still running. Yes. I'm going to try typing in another bunch of gibberish in here and see if it still works. Yep, everything still works. Excellent. All right, moving on. And the first thing we need to do when we're talking about databases is, of course, create tables and figure out what the schema is. This is the schema for our app. It's a very simple application. It even doesn't have users. It just has reminders. That's all it has. So all we want to do is we want to create a table, if it doesn't exist, called reminders. And you might be asking, why don't I just do create table? Well, because if you accidentally run this command twice, it won't just delete the table and create it again. It's just a nice thing to do because you might end up messing yourself up with something like that in the future. So it's just better to write if not exists. It's really simple to do. So if we go through this, I'm not sure how familiar you are with SQL, but you're creating a table called reminders. The primary key on that table will be reminder underscore ID. This is a little trick I picked up from Slack. The Slack API is they always return what it is the ID of, not just a column called ID. And it's actually kind of useful, and a friend of mine, Adrian, also uses it in his apps, and like every time he builds something. It's actually really a good way of doing it because you'll always remember what ID you're talking about. It makes it a lot easier to, for context's sake, to know what you're talking about. And also when it comes to joins, if you're joining two tables, right, and they have different keys, different columns, and one of them has an ID column and another one has an ID column. They're both the same ID. So then if you join them, you then have to create aliases for those ID columns. Otherwise, you're going to end up with IDs, two IDs that need the same slot, and only one of them shows up. So yeah, basically it's way nicer to do this. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to create a file called, first of all, we're going to create a new directory called SQL. And inside of it, we're going to create a schema.sql. Ta-da! And once again, I'm getting formatted from the copy paste. Ah! So I'm going to fix the formatting a bit before I move on because I have a problem with this. All right. So here we go. We have the schema. Now, how do we get it into the database? Well, we can open up a SQL GUI, or we can run it PSQL, but that's not as nice as it could be, right? We could do better than that. So what we're going to do is create a little initialize script for the database. So that's going to go in the bin folder. Now the bin folder stands for binary. It also exists on your machine. There's a bin folder. It's just a common convention that things that are executable tend to go in the bin folder. So why not put this script into the bin folder? And we're going to make a subfolder called DB because we want to make sure that we're communicating that the database is the thing that's being initialized. And so we're creating the directory called bindb. We are creating a file called init, and we are doing this little thing here, which is adding the adding the X permission on that file. X stands for executable, so you can run it from your command line without any fancy stuff. You can just type in bin db init and it will run. So let's go ahead and run this code. All right, so we created a directory called bindb. We're creating a file called init. You see here, created a file, and then we're going to chmod it to have executable permissions so it can run. And we're going to write it in Node.js because the rest of the app's in JavaScript. This is a JavaScript course, not a Bash script course. So why not continue with the theme, and we'll get our script to be run by JavaScript, Node.js more specifically. And to do that, if you don't have a file extension on it, you need to tell your shell how to run it. And this is done via a mechanism called a shebang. I didn't make it up. It's also called a hashbang. And the hashbang for Node, the one that's more or less agreed upon to be the correct one, and there's definitely counter arguments to this, but this is the one I use and it's never failed me, is user bin env node. So that will run this script in Node. And the rest of the file, oh, that's why. Sorry, 1 second. I didn't have it in play mode. That's why I couldn't copy the code. That was driving me nuts. All right, so here we are. You'll notice that no syntax highlighting because, of course, it doesn't have a file extension, so how is it supposed to know? We're going to change the language mode to JavaScript so it's a little easier to read. Here we are. So what's this file doing exactly? It's, of course, using the hashbang here. It's loading in a database URL, or it's checking to see if the database URL is present in the environment variables and otherwise loads .env. You'll remember that's a module that allows you to use .env files in order to define environment variables. So that's what we're doing here. The next thing, we are loading in the read file sync from the file system node module. And we're loading in our database initializer. Now you'll remember we wrote this thing really basic, right? So all it is just a pool. It doesn't have any extra functionality on it. So we can reuse it in lots of different places in our app, anywhere we need a database. So here we are, we're just importing a connection pool from our initializers. And then we are creating this run function, and we're running that run function at the end. And lastly, we are telling the process to exit when it's done. So it's going to read your schema file, which is loading from the SQL directory. And then it's going to try to run it, or otherwise, show you errors and things like that. And this is the syntax for what to do with a pool using .query. So the pool so this would be pool.query, and then you run the actual schema query. So let's go ahead and do that. Bin db init. So here we are. We ran our command. Everything ran correctly. It's supposed to output the query into the console here, which it does. Let's see if it's created the proper stuff. So I have a database called remindist staging. That's, I believe, what it is. Yeah, I was using this as a test, so I'm going to go ahead and drop this table, and I'm going to try to run this command again, just to show you that it works. Okay, so there should be a table called reminders in here now. That's right, there it is, and it's empty. Yep, and there's all the fields that we asked for. So this database initializer is working. So this is really simple. You probably only need to run this once when you initialize the app in any one environment. So that's probably maybe on production you run this on your staging environment or your development environment or whatever you want. But all it does is essentially runs this one command and everyone's happy. And once again, because it's create table if not exists, it's not going to delete your data and then create a new table out of it. It's going to be smart when that happens, so it'll know better than to wipe your data for you, which is not a very nice thing to have happen to you. Believe me, I've been there. Okay, so that's our initdb script. I hope this is all clear and I'm not going too fast. If it is, feel free to throw your lot in the chat and just tell me to slow the hell down, which I don't mind doing. But yeah, otherwise let's keep going. And then lastly, let's modify our form slightly. So right now, if you remember, our really basic, ugly form on the root page already collects an email and a message. So you see here on the home page, you have an email field and a message field, right? So we just need to add one more field in order to collect one last piece of critical information we need in order to process these reminders. And the hint of what we need to add is right here in the database, right? So we already are collecting the email, we're collecting the message. We need to now collect the send at time, date. So we need to know when this reminder is supposed to be delivered. That's kind of the whole point of the app. You need to be able to send it to yourself in the future. So if I schedule something for 3 days from now, that's when it needs to be sent, not this second or never or at a random time, So we need to create another field to collect this data. Now, because we are, of course, still building a very early prototypical sort of thing, we don't need to worry about user niceties at this moment. So let's just create a new div and stick a new type of input into it called date. This won't work in all browsers, so just a fair warning. But Firefox supports it, and Chrome supports it, and Safari supports it, so who really cares about any of the others? And what this does is it creates this wonderful field without you having to put any JavaScript modules together. That is a date picker, right? Why wasn't this around when the initial spec for input fields was created? I don't know, but it seems like a really great thing. It's really nicely collects the dates, formats it for you, and everyone's happy. Life is good when you use HTML5. And the next thing is, of course, we want to show to the user what it is that we have collected, because we want to be able to verify that things are working, right? So that's what we're going to do right here in newreminder.hps. So I'd like to remind you real quick, we have a routes folder, right? And inside of there is the individual routes. This is the URL of where the route is at. This is the template that it uses that's linked to the templates folder, new reminder. And this is the method. And on the home page, of course, we have a form, and that form posts to that endpoint, /new. And when it does, this data hook is run. And then after it's done running, we go on to the rendering stage of the actual template. And that's when this template gets all of its data. And it can also receive the email, the message, and the send at, because that was part of the form data that the person submitted. All right, so everything is supposed to work. Let's see if this does work. Whoops. All right, we'll select a random date, the 28th. Voila! Okay, so we're collecting an email, we're collecting a message, and we're collecting a send at date. Isn't that great? Now, of course, now that the form is all done and everyone's happy, we need to do something with this data. That's the important thing. But before that, I would like to touch on a particularly uninteresting subject for some, very interesting for others, and that's security. There's something that if you're actually building this app for real, and which we will end up in the end releasing it, but we need to worry about something called cross-site request forgery. So this is, I included this link in the notes. This is a great write-up done by people from Pillar.js, which is, I think, a framework of some sort for HTTP. Anyways, they talk about what CSRF is, so it's a cross-request forgery, and how to mitigate it. Using many different methods, one of them being CSRF tokens. So we will go into those a little bit when we talk about security, but that's not yet. So right now we're just worried about getting the app started. So yeah, so we've done this. We've added the date input field, and we've created an output for that form. So everything is ready to roll. Okay, now this part is a little bit more of a paradigm thing, something that I like to, maybe something I just made up a little bit, but database actions. So an action is something that happens to your database. That's what I define it as. So a create, read, update, or delete is going to, go through action files. An action is just, like an action that you want to perform on a database, and we just save it into a specific folder so that you can access them from anywhere. Like for instance, you might have a script for sending the actual data or the emails to people. So we'll have to write a little cron job that runs. So every little while it sends the actual data to people, or the emails. But that is going to have to use some of the common logic that we use in the web application as well. So why not make it extensible, reusable, and all that wonderful stuff? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to write all of our database logic not in the routes. We're going to write it into its own folder called actions. So that's what actions are. Because we don't have an object relational mapper, we're not worried about models or anything like that. So we're just creating actions. They're just self-contained things that your app wants to do. For example, logging in might have several different queries run or steps. Might even involve more than one database in some applications. But in our case, we're just going to put them all into one folder called actions, and then anywhere where you need to use the login functionality, you can then include login. So I'm not sure if you're sold on the idea, but I am, because it creates a sort of a separation of concerns, and it doesn't go too far, like creating a whole ORM around it. So we're going to create an actions folder, and inside of that, we're going to create a file called get or new reminder, and we're going to create another file called index.js. Now, index.js is going to be somewhat familiar to you because it's going to be the same as what the routes folder has in index.js, very similar. What it does is it pulls in all of the files in the actions folder that are not index.js. And then it creates a nice little handy, tidy object out of it and exports it for us using glob. So the output of this will be actually the new reminder file and then the function that it exports. Speaking of, here it is. So it's really simple, right? This is all we're doing. We are running this insert query on our database. If you're familiar with SQL, this will be like probably one of the first things you probably learned when you're running SQL queries, how to insert data into your table. That's all we're doing. We're inserting data into reminders. There's 3 fields and 3 values that we're inserting. And this returning thing means that the data is returned as a row so that we can show it or use it for something later. So the Node Postgres module comes already with the parameterized functionality built in. Now, parameterized, you might notice that if you're not familiar with this, the $1, $2, and $3, we don't just stick values we get from forms into our SQL queries, because this is what SQL injection is. In fact, like I remember Sony got hacked with an SQL injection on their login screen, I believe it was, and I thought to myself, like, they're idiots. How do you not protect against this? Like, and in fact, Postgres, not just this module, has this built right into it. So you'd actually have to go out of your way not to use this. And don't be one of those people that like leaks data everywhere just because you didn't protect yourself against an SQL injection. An SQL injection is super easy to protect yourself against just by doing this. This goes a long way. Like, you're not immune when you do this. There's still ways you could be reached, but this closes a lot of attack vectors just by doing that. So long story short, the query function is what we want to run on the database pool, right? So the first argument of this new reminder is going to be the database object. So we're going to insert our query here. And then the second argument is the actual values that should be substituted for these $signs. So email, message, and send at. That's in that order, right? So because that's what we define the order here. And then, we're awaiting this, and then what returns is the first row of our successful query, because we're saying returning. The first row will be the relevant one, the one we just inserted. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to run this in here. So you're probably wondering, maybe your head is spinning a little bit, so I apologize if maybe I'm going too fast. But now comes the step to actually use this database stuff. And we use it in the new reminder.js route, right? So I've got it open already. So first of all, let's import the actions. And just to give you an idea of what's actually in the actions, let's go ahead and do that first. So I will just console log this out. Yeah, look at me using the basic debug method of console log again. But you see that the output is the file name of the action, and then the asynchronous function that it exports. So that'll be this one. So all we actually need is new reminder, not actions. Da-da-da. All right, so this is a function that will do the work for us. So that just adds one small step right here. So what this does is, of course, it runs our action, the new reminder action. You're passing the database in and form data, which will contain the key values of the actual form submission. So that has a message, a send at, and a email address where it should be sent. And then it, of course, returns, as you remember, the reminder itself. And so we're collecting that here, and we're going to return the reminder so that it's available as an actual database row in our template, for one. So we can test whether this is working by saying data received, and then we'll say the ID of this reminder is, and it should have a reminder ID, because that's one of the fields in the database. So this is basically a working version of our app that will save everything into your database. And I think we should stop right here, because otherwise we're moving maybe a little too fast. Enjoy this weird GIF that I found of someone being rubbed onto a giant popsicle. I don't know where it comes from. If you know, then let me know, but it's kind of hilarious looking, so here it is. Alright, so let's go ahead and try out our app. Okay, so if I fill in an email address, mike@feev.io, and I type in a message, hello, and I send this to myself on the 26th, which is Friday, and I submit. Voila. Okay, so the data has been saved. You see that it has an ID of 1, a reminder ID of 1. The email address, mike@feev.io, the message, hello, ! And we're sending it at this date, Friday, July 26th, 2019, at basically as soon as the clock turns to the new day, and Hong Kong Standard Time. So let's check our database. Query should be in there. That's right, there it is. Very simple query, and it is all inserted nicely. So you basically have the half of the app where people create stuff done, and that's something to celebrate, because we've actually achieved a lot here. The next stage will be making our app look like an actual product and not a piece of crap. So like, people haven't built apps that look like this in a long time, for good reason, because it's not very friendly looking. And yeah, so we're going to be building an actual interface to this app. We're going to make it look somewhat pretty. And to do that, we're going to use CSS and JavaScript on the client side. But to do that properly, we need to add some more steps. So for example, if you're going to load a JavaScript file, you need to Babelify it or do some kind of transpiling to it so that it works in most browsers. So basically, when you write code, you need to transpile the code. So we're going to write a really simple thing that figures out if the file that we want needs to be transpiled, or in the case of CSS, we're going to use a preprocessor or postprocessor for our CSS, so that you can, for example, have includes and multiple files and things like that. So look forward to that. So that'll be next session. But yeah, in this session, we basically finished the user-facing side of the app minus the styling. So the app basically works. And then I think the session after, the last session, we're going to worry about sending out the data to the actual user at the right date and the right time. And that'll be the last session. Unless you can convince me to do another one on something else, but then this kind of the base series will be over. I'm thinking I might just release a few more sessions here and there on certain things. Like, for example, you could do a lot to optimize this app to make it faster and more efficient. You could also, we do need to probably cover security, so we're going to cover security and a few other topics. But yeah, overall, in 2 more sessions, this will all be done. So yeah, reach out to me if you have any feedback on my Twitter, mtimofeev, or join the Telegram channel, which is, I think, for me, the preferred method of communication, because it's easier for me to keep track of the communication. Yeah, as always, the code is available. It's already on GitHub. You can look it up on this link here. frameworkless.js is the organization, remind.ist is the project, and stage 4 is the branch. And today's session is running on part 4.remind.ist. So that pretty much concludes things for me. Thanks for joining. I look forward to hearing from you and also maybe having another session. I think I probably will create another package. Probably the responder portion of the logic I'm going to create a package for. So that'll be just like the body parser, because I just think it makes more sense to put that logic into, now that we've already built it, so you know how it works, you know how easy it can actually be. There's no reason to make it boilerplate code you have to copy and paste from app to app. So let's just take what we have and make it a nice module. And we created it together, right? So it's something we walked through together. We sat here on the stream and watched replays and stuff. And we created these modules. So why not make them exportable and usable anywhere, I say. So that's what we're going to do. All right, well, that concludes my babbling. So I'll see you guys hopefully in 2 weeks. The next stream will be, let me check the calendar. Next stream will be the 6th of August. So I will be in Bali at that time. Hopefully I'll have good internet and a nice room that's not as cramped. I'm kind of feeling a little claustrophobic here. Yeah, see you next time. Bye.